Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is an exciting moment for the U.S. Transhumanist Party, as this is our first virtual Enlightenment Salon in collaboration with KGRA Radio. So we are going to be able to reach many more destinations, many more viewers, and carry these excellent conversations to new audiences throughout the world. And today we are joined by an illustrious panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker, our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, and our Director of Scholarship, Dan Elton. And our special guest today is an individual who is renowned throughout the transhumanist movement. He is one of the co-founders of the World Transhumanist Organization, and he is one of the leading philosophers of transhumanism, David Pearce. He is famous for his thoughts on the abolition of suffering and the hedonistic imperative. We had him as a guest on a previous virtual Enlightenment Salon, essentially a year ago on November 8th, 2020. And that was, in my view, one of the most fascinating conversations we've had on this series. So we welcome him again. David, thank you so much for joining us. And please tell us about your endeavors over the past year, in particular, the Biohappiness Revolution, which is your forthcoming book. What is it about, and how can we achieve the kind of ideal that you describe?
With you. Yes, I am shortly going to be releasing a book, The Biohappiness Revolution, which essentially is an update of the hedonistic imperative. The hedonistic imperative, and sorry for the rather debauched title, is the name of an online manifesto I wrote back in the year 1995. The hedonistic imperative essentially calls for the use of biotechnology to phase out suffering throughout the living world and to replace the biology of pain and misery and discontent with a new kind of architecture of mind, life based entirely on information-sensitive gradients of well-being. Now, the abolitionist project is hugely ambitious. That goes without saying, but I hope in this discussion we can talk about some of the different strands of the project. But the transhumanist movement is vast, and I should be clear that, I mean, people ask, what is transhumanism? Transhumanism can be summarized in terms of the three supers, I think, essentially: super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. And yes, as a transhumanist, I hope that we can build a triple S civilization. But my own particular focus, my own work has been on the problem of suffering and how to get rid, essentially, of the horrors of Darwinian life and replace them by something wonderful, perhaps even sublime. Now, okay, fancy words. How on earth does one bring this about? Number of strands to the project. I'm only going to talk for a few minutes just before throwing this open, so this isn't going to be a very long spiel. In the case of humans, the only way to get rid of suffering, an ancient ideal, in the long run is going to be to rewrite our genetic source code. And now this is technically feasible. For example, all prospective parents can, in principle, be offered the choice pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, genome editing, to choose such things as their the pain sensitivity and hedonic range of their future children. I mean, just for example, the SCN9A gene, the volume knob for pain, dozens of different alleles, nonsense mutations, no pain at all. That would be premature. Others extremely high or extremely low pain threshold. And essentially, for both pain and hedonic range, an approximate hedonic set point, i.e. whether your kids are going to be temperamentally super happy or malaise-ridden, essentially it's going to be feasible for all prospective parents worldwide to actually choose these default settings for their future children. Not merely future humans, though. For the first time this year, a serious genetic condition, transthyretin amyloidosis, was treated with CRISPR gene therapy, CRISPR infusion. Within the next 10, 15, 20 years, it's going to be possible for existing humans to have their genome upgraded. And this can extend from everything from mood to pain sensitivity to super centenarian genes. Very, very exciting. Lots could go wrong. But tremendously exciting. But in terms of the abolitionist project, humans are just one species on Earth. It's going to be vital to help humble minds too. And cultured meat and animal products promise an end to factory farming and slaughterhouses. A pig, for example, is as sentient and demonstrably as sapient as a human pre-linguistic toddler. I think as a matter of urgency, we should be focusing on getting animal abuse, factory farms and slaughterhouses ended ASAP, and the most realistic way to do this is to accelerate the development, commercialization of cultured meat and animal products. The final strand of the abolitionist project on Earth, and then I'm going to throw things open, is suffering in nature. Now, intuitively, there is absolutely nothing that can be done for the cruelties of nature. Red in tooth and claw, a lot of people would assume Darwinian natural selection. Repealing it is rather like repealing the second law of thermodynamics. But this isn't the case. The level of suffering in nature is shortly going to be an adjustable parameter. We can use everything from germline editing to cross-species fertility regulation to gene drive technologies. Very exciting. Gene drives cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance, enable us to drive desirable genes across entire species. So in theory, at any rate, and this isn't a prediction, it would be possible, and perhaps under the auspices of the UN World Health Organization, to have a 100-year plan to defeat the biology of involuntary suffering. That isn't a prediction because there will obviously be a lot of opposition from bioconservatives, folk who uphold the genetic status quo. Yet we are living in the final century in which suffering is biologically inevitable. And as a true transhumanist, I advocate biological genetic solutions to the problem of suffering in conjunction with more traditional routes, socio-economic political reform.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that overview, David. We are living in the final century in which biological suffering is inevitable. Those are powerful words, and if that is indeed the case, then hopefully our audience can see the imperative behind those words. We have some excellent comments coming in already. Ginger Peterson states, I love your stance on cultured meat. Thanks for all your work. John H. speaks with regard to suffering, so let's repeal it then. Someday, Daniel Twett says, repeal suffering, vote USTP. Rudy Hoffman says, hello, dear visionary colleagues. I have loved this guy, meaning David Pearce, since reading his many writings. David Pearce is wonderful. Allison Winterland says, I don't know if the bioluminescent platypus is biohappy, but what do I know? I think perhaps the ability to induce bioluminescence in organisms through genetic modification is a first step, a proof of concept that we can modify genomes to produce a certain effect. Of course, the modification of emotional states is a bit more complex. And I'm curious, David, what do you think will be some of the first breakthroughs in that realm? Not just achieving certain physical traits through genome editing, but certain dispositions toward, say, less pain or more favorable emotional states. How could this be done, and when do you think that's realistically likely to arise?
Oh, good question. Because there is still tremendous opposition to anything to do with genome editing. Here's an example. In the news last year was this retired vegan Scottish school teacher, Jo Cameron. Transpires she has an extraordinarily high pain threshold. She never gets depressed or anxious. She went through life thinking she was completely normal. Anyway, she came to the attention of the medical authorities, and it transpires she has this very unusual dual mutation of the far and far out genes. And in consequence, she has extremely high levels of anandamide. This from the Sanskrit word meaning bliss. Anandamide is this endogenous cannabinoid, and its interaction with the opioid receptors essentially means that she has an extremely high hedonic set point. That she is socially responsible. I mentioned she was a vegan school teacher and so on, and yet she doesn't suffer in the way the rest of us do. Now, intuitively, what can be done about this? But both for future humans and for existing humans, via the use of CRISPR infusions, this would need to be done in a controlled trial first. But nonetheless, it would be possible to do a controlled trial of genome editing for existing humans, giving them Jo Cameron's dual mutation. Now, countless things could go wrong here, which is one reason for having well-controlled clinical trials. Now, what about creating new life? At the moment, essentially anyone who thinks it's ethically permissible to have children, to bring new life and suffering into the world, essentially having kids today is a genetic crapshoot. And I think anyone who does think it's ethically appropriate to create life has an obligation to load the genetic dice in their children's favor. So I would favor controlled trials in which new offspring were given versions of the Jo Cameron's versions of the far and far out genes. Now, lots could go wrong. I mean, there's always a danger of sliding between being a researcher or an ethicist and an ethicist and a propagandist. And I don't want in any way to minimize the pitfalls here. For example, here in the UK, I don't know what the statistics are in the USA, but something like 1 in 7 kids ends up in casualty each year, generally not with something serious. It's just accidents happen. And it is vitally important, if one is trying to minimize pain, that one preserves the function of nociception, the ability to respond to noxious stimuli. Likewise, if one is raising hedonic range and hedonic set points. It's vitally important to preserve information sensitivity. It sounds, it's a lot of jargon, this information sensitive well-being, but what we really want to do, if we're to create a world of life based on gradients of intelligent bliss, is hedonic uplift. But nonetheless, this isn't science fiction. This isn't talking about some kind of singularity or post-human superintelligence. This would be feasible to do in the next few years. Tremendous ethical dilemmas here. But if we're serious about delivering health, and recall that the World Health Organization actually defines health in terms of complete physical, social, emotional well-being, ridiculously, well, not ridiculously, an insanely ambitious transhumanist definition of health. The only way to create a world in which all sentient beings are healthy is going to be this kind of intervention. I mean, I'm probably sounding right now like a very crude genetic determinist. I'm not. There are all kinds of other measures that need to be introduced to have a truly civilized society. But something like universal basic income, access to healthcare, you name it, lots of things too. But I particularly focus on the biological genetic.
Yes, thank you, David. And this, of course, raises a series of interesting questions with regard to pain and suppressing pain. Of course, evolutionarily, pain was emerged as an indicator that something is wrong. So if you feel pain in one of your limbs, it means your limb is injured. You should probably take steps to protect itself. The problem is it's an imperfect indicator in the sense that it can last far beyond the actual danger. It can provide a false signal if your nerves are damaged. And furthermore, it can last beyond your ability to do anything about it. So once you've gotten the pain signal, you know there's a problem. And if you've tried to do something about it, the signal still remains. It's just extra suffering. However, it does convey certain information. So this is connected also to a question from Daniel Smith, who wonders, is happiness free of context dangerous, i.e. induce permanent bliss in the face of problems requiring a sense of urgency and collaborative response for us to face together and solve? So if we do moderate or get rid of biological negative sensations like pain, what would replace them to still serve as that signaling mechanism and inform us if there is something amiss that we can try to fix?
Yes, this is a really important question. Some people, there's a distinction between being blissful and being blissed out. And although for some people at least being blissed out might seem appealing, it is not a viable long-term solution to the problem of suffering. Tragically, today, there are some people who are chronically in pain and depressed, and they go through their life animated by information-sensitive gradients of ill-being. But at the other extreme, there are some people who are temperamentally extremely happy with a high hedonic set point, and they essentially go through life animated by gradients of well-being. Sorry for the jargon. I mean, what is the hedonic set point? The hedonic set point is the approximate place around which your emotions, positive and negative, tend to fluctuate in the course of a lifetime. There is the so-called lottery paradox, that 6 months after winning the lottery or becoming quadriplegic in a terrible accident, most people will revert to their previous default average level of well-being or ill-being before the win or the tragedy. Now, this is a bit simplistic. There are many complications, but nonetheless, the hedonic treadmill is this set of negative feedback mechanisms in the brain that stops most of us being very happy or very sad for very long. And each of us has this approximate hedonic set point. For some people, it's a bit above zero. For some, it's a bit below zero. Tragically, there are many hundreds of millions of people who spend their life chronically depressed. They spend their lives much below hedonic zero. But at the other extreme, there are so-called hyperthymic people with an extremely high hedonic set point. They're not manic. They're simply temperamentally very happy. They respond appropriately to good and bad stimuli, but they don't get depressed. And before going on to an ambitious transhumanist or post-human civilization of life based on gradients of superhuman bliss or anything fantastical or sci-fi like that, we need to ratchet up hedonic set points so that everyone can, at a minimum, enjoy the information-sensitive gradients of well-being enjoyed by the luckiest, high-functioning, hyperthymic people today.
Yes, and I think that's a worthwhile aspiration. Now, David Shoemaker has a related question along these lines. David, please proceed.
Yeah, thank you. From David to David. I was just wondering, pain is, or the lack of it, is fundamental to the idea, I think, of super intelligence, super longevity, super happiness. That sounds entirely reasonable. I was just wondering, has there ever been any studies done on this that supports that idea?
Well, one of the characteristics of the revolution in computing and AI is the progressive divorce of consciousness from intelligence. And, just to take an example, something like playing chess. I mean, essentially, machines can now outperform humans without a pleasure-pain axis. And the machines are systematically outperforming humans in ever more cognitive domains. Now, I'm personally a skeptic about full spectrum machine superintelligence. I think full spectrum superintelligence is going to be genetically rewritten AI augmented biological descendants. But essentially, if the raw feels of pain or suffering were critical to any intellectual task, this would amount to a revolution in computer science and AI. Essentially, the raw feels of nastiness, pain, and happiness, suffering, and jealousy, they don't seem to be cognitively indispensable. And there are different. So clearly, we don't want to turn humans into complete cyborgs. But what we do want to do, I would say, is get rid of the nasty raw feels. Certain human emotions, for example, like jealousy, we might decide that we want to get rid both of the function of jealousy. Why does jealousy exist? It helps our genes leave more copies of themselves, or it did in the ancestral environment. It would seem sensible to get rid of both jealousy, both the raw feels and the function. But something else like anxiety or dips in mood, it's going to be vital to preserve the functional role, even if we want to phase out the raw feels. And it's interesting doing studies, not just of depressive people who are most studied, but also hyperthymic people, i.e. people who are extremely happy and optimistic. What kinds of cognitive dysfunction, cognitive bias do they have? And yes, it's real, and it's something. Before going gung-ho and trying to abolish suffering altogether, yes, one must be mindful of the risks. For example, one wants perhaps to conserve the functional analog of depressive realism.
Yes, thank you, David and David. We have an interesting question as well from Chris McCauley, who wonders what happens to all the pigs already in existence if factory farming is replaced by lab-grown meat. And we can broaden this to any other animals that are currently subjected to factory farming. And he asks, wouldn't it be a form of mass genocide to eliminate farming on a whole? There has to be a distinction drawn, in his view, between factory farming and other types of farming. And indeed, I can see where he's coming from in the sense that right now the number of animals of a certain species is much larger than would have existed otherwise because they are being bred for food. And if they hadn't been bred for food, there would be many fewer of them in existence to begin with. If they're no longer needed to be bred for food, then presumably we will approach a world in which their population is significantly reduced, or at least the creation of new ones is significantly reduced. But what do we do with the existing ones in order to be consistent with minimizing suffering and treating them in a humane way?
Yes, I would hope that the surviving victims can be rehabilitated. Yes, it's true that there are a quite extraordinarily large number of pigs in the world, and that is because they are factory farmed. Factory farming is inherently abusive, and the reason that non-human animals in factory farms are tail-docked, debeaked, declawed, castrated, and so forth is otherwise, in their desperation, they mutilate themselves and each other. So yeah, eventually they're spending most of their lives below hedonic zero in a dreadful state. So yeah, we should not be breeding non-human animals for that purpose. But rather than simply aiming for less cruelty in animal agriculture, I think we should be aiming to phase it out altogether. We should be systematically helping sentient beings. And from the Transhumanist Declaration, 1998, 2009, to the latest version of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, yeah, a commitment to the well-being of all sentients. It's not just about reducing cruelty and abuse. It's about actively helping sentient beings. And realistically, the fastest way to do this, I mean, obviously, personally, I would urge anyone listening to quit meat and animal products and go vegan. But let's be realistic. This isn't going to happen via moral argument alone. Transhumanism is about technical solutions to ethical problems. And the best way to get factory farms, slaughterhouses shut and outlawed is to get cultured meat and animal products onto the shelves. And they needn't be genetically engineered too. This is really important. Some people will initially be very suspicious. Frankenfoods and the like, although cultured meat and animal products could most certainly be nutritionally enhanced, flavorfully enhanced. From a PR perspective, it's going to be much better, at least initially, to preserve precisely existing DNA. This is obviously a huge topic, but yeah, if you compare the debate over abortion, let's say in the USA, compared to a fetus, a pig or a lamb or a cow is vastly more sentient.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And it seems to me that the technological solution will be the only one that could potentially result in humans not killing animals for food, because I do think it's unrealistic to expect everybody to become vegan. Many people will refuse to become vegan only for nutritional considerations, especially if they believe they need large amounts of iron. I know a lot of athletes, runners, for instance, will say, I need to eat meat because it's a source of iron, and I will experience an iron deficiency if I'm a long distance runner and I don't have it. But on the other hand, if lab grown meat is available, I personally would happily pay a premium for it and get the same biologically identical food, but food that doesn't require the killing of animals. Now, there's an interesting comment here by Joey Hayes. And first of all, thank you to Joey Hayes for his compliment. But he also writes, everyone has to fall off a skateboard or BMX at least 14 times. And he's referring to certain activities that people do for sport, where I think he's suggesting that suffering is part of the learning experience. That is, to improve in that sport, to get better, to learn certain lessons. At least some people think it helps to fail and get slightly hurt on occasion. And I myself am a trail runner. I've had my share of falls, thankfully not serious falls. I don't like them and I don't subscribe to this philosophy, but other trail runners have told me that essentially a certain proportion of falls is inevitable. The probability can never be reduced to zero, and it is part of the experience. So what do you say in response to that sort of claim? Is there any value to mild suffering as a learning experience as long as one can recover from it and become better?
Yeah, and today there are a few people today who have congenital insensitivity to pain. Not merely do they not experience any of the nasty raw feels of physical pain, they lack the function of nociception, and they have to lead cotton wool existences, or else they come to a sticky end. And in fact, in nature, it would be fatal. However, if you look at, there's a range of pain sensitivity. And if ever you've known someone who says about physical pain, pain, it's just a useful signaling mechanism, i.e. they don't like being in pain. Of course they don't. But nonetheless, they have an extremely high pain tolerance. And although in the medium to long term, I do envisage a transhumanist civilization with no experience below hedonic zero at all, perhaps, for example, via degree of cyborgization, such as if you had a sensor that automatically withdraws your hand from the hot stove before you do any damage and so on. That might be feasible. Likewise, it may be feasible to various tweaks to create life based entirely on gradients of well-being. But before the really ambitious stuff, I think the priority is getting people up to the high pain tolerance of today's outliers, i.e. nothing very exotic, but nonetheless pain essentially becomes manageable. And if I don't know, it's there are some. I've got one friend here in Brighton. He's just incredibly high pain threshold, and he just couldn't understand when I said, look, I would sign away the keys to my flat rather than endure 10 seconds of torture or something. There is tremendous variability in pain tolerance. Essentially, evolution doesn't care. It's just played around with the dials. Now, yes, there are risks. Clearly, there are risks in having an extremely high pain threshold. But what is rather counterintuitive is that the people who love life the most, high pain thresholds, high hedonic set points, they are actually often the people, because they love life so much, they're keen to protect and preserve it. Some of the happiest people I know are engaged in the field of existential risk reduction, whereas people who are in pain or people who are depressive, they will tend to have shorter lifespans. But clearly all kinds of things could go wrong. This needs to be exhaustively researched. But nonetheless, we've got to move away from the genetic crapshoot. We have to ensure when bringing new life into the world that we're not bringing unacceptable suffering.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, David. And Rudy Hoffman writes, great points, David Pearce. Evolution does not give a hoot about us individually. He also asks, can we agree that most of our physical and psychic pain is a vestige of our animal background, and we should attenuate both? And this is what you were saying, David, that the first step would be to get everybody toward the high pain tolerance thresholds of some people who are already around today and are capable of functioning well because they still get the signaling from pain, but it's not debilitating. And it seems that pain becomes a real problem when it's so severe that it prevents people from acting. If the pain is signaling a problem, but it's that adverse and it's felt that intensely, then the person cannot sometimes muster the ability to actually solve the problem. Now, Daniel Twett wonders, can we be sure that pleasure doesn't rely on a contrast with pain? And I have my own thoughts on this, but David, I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, this is quite an intuitively compelling idea that pleasure and pain are largely, if not wholly, relative. But as I was saying, that tragically, there are some people today who are chronically depressed. Some chronically depressed people can't imagine what it's like to be happy. In its really severe cases, they don't even understand what the word happiness means. One wouldn't say that they can't understand the nature of suffering because they're chronically depressed. At the other extreme, there are some people who are constitutionally happy. I sometimes give the example of a transhumanist colleague, Anders Sandberg, who says, I do have a ridiculously high hedonic set point. Now, Anders certainly knows he is happy. I mean, he was pressed to make this remark, but it's just part of the fabric of his reality. And yeah, he really loves life. And I suspect most of us actually know people who, there's tremendous enthusiasm for life, and it's not dependent on a contrast with suffering. Even in a future, and I stress this is more far future, transhuman, post-human civilization, if today's hedonic range is, let's say, -10 to 0, neutral experience to +10, imagine a future civilization of +30 to +40, or even +70 to +100. One can actually increase contrast, even if the darkest depths of post-human civilization are better than today's peak experiences. I mean, the other example one can actually give, I speak as a rather prudish celibate Brit, lovemaking. You know, it's, if done properly, it's generically pleasurable throughout, but it has peaks and troughs. But what is critical, just to wrap this up, what is critical, though, to intelligence is preserving information sensitivity.
Thank you, David. And it is indeed interesting to contemplate how in a transhuman or post-human civilization, the range of human experience will vary and compare with our own. And I would like to delve into that in a bit more depth later. But first, we have a question from Dan Elton. Dan, please proceed.
Yeah, hello. I have a couple questions, but I think the one I think is most relevant here is if we want to say advocate for liberalization of the regulatory framework and say more funding going into gene editing, biotech, what is the sort of lowest hanging fruit? Like, what is the sort of like killer app or first thing that people are people are going to get excited about, which is not just preventing congenital illnesses, but actually moving us in the direction of the hedonic the hedonistic imperative. Personally, I'm thinking that it would be preventing severe mental illness or lowering the probability of children having and developing severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia or depression. But I'm curious what you think.
Yes, I mean, realistically, if we're talking what is, sociologically, politically feasible, it's not going to be done in the guise of some kind of transhumanist agenda, let alone the hedonistic imperative. It is going to be done in the guise of something like innovative treatments for refractory depression or something like that. And unlike pain, though there are hundreds of genes and thousands of alleles involved in pain processing, pain sensitivity, one can point to this master volume knob for pain, the SCN9A gene. Unlike physical pain, there is no volume knob for emotional pain, and it is going to be much more complicated doing the genetic screening, counseling, genome editing, if we are going to be trying to ensure that all our offspring have a high hedonic set point. If we target even a handful of genes, earlier I mentioned the far and far out gene, we mentioned the CONT gene, catechol methyltransferase gene, handful of other genes with benign and less benign variants, it will be possible to load the dice, but nonetheless, candidly, this is going to involve experiments. I mean, all kids today are genetic experiments. Realistically, genome editing is first going to be used to correct the well-known genetic diseases. Physical genetic diseases, cystic fibrosis, this kind of thing. But the idea, as I said, I am very, very keen this idea of offering all prospective parents universal access to pre-implantation screening and counseling. It's going to be messy and complicated. And sooner or later, too, there is going to be there are going to be tragedies and disasters, because one knows having kids, all kinds of things can go wrong. And that with the best will in the world, all the research in the world, there are going to be missteps. I think this is absolutely unavoidable. And there's no way around this, but if we aren't actually prepared to edit our genetic source code, then pain and suffering will last indefinitely.
Yes. Thank you, David. And now we have a question from John H. that I think is relevant. He wonders, David, whether you would regard yourself as an anti-natalist. He got this impression from your previous comments. However, based on your comments just now, that's not my impression. My impression is you are concerned that when new life is created, it's not going to be subject to large amounts of suffering. However, if it can be done in a systematic way to minimize the amount of suffering experienced by that new life form, you would not be opposed to that being done. Would that be a correct characterization?
Yes, I mean, it's complicated, because if one essentially is a secular Buddhist, if one thinks our overriding obligation is to minimize, mitigate, prevent suffering, what's the way forward? Now, there are a minority of people, a small minority of people, some negative utilitarians, strong antinatalists, ephilists, who think, the way to get rid of suffering is essentially for children, for humans to stop breeding, stop having kids. However, this is not a viable solution to the problem of suffering. all that not having kids does is impose selection pressure against any predisposition to antinatalism. So although I respect hugely the choice of people who choose not to have kids or to adopt, this antinatalism is not a viable solution to the problem of suffering. The future of life, the future of sentience belongs to fanatical life lovers. And yeah, I think antinatalists, people like David Benatar, need to get to grips with the nature of selection pressure, which essentially means that, yeah, antinatalism is not a viable solution to the problem of suffering. Whereas if we are prepared to actually tackle the biological genetic roots of suffering, essentially when creating new life, instead of creating new suffering, we are going to be creating gradients of well-being. Now, yeah, the purists may object that at least until we really start seriously rewriting the genome, that some suffering is going to be created by having kids. But yeah, when outlining possible solutions to the problem of suffering, it's vital to combine what is technically feasible with what is sociologically realistic. And so, yeah, I although, yes, if someone asks, yeah, I'm a soft antinatalist, I wouldn't personally bring new life and suffering into the world. This is most certainly not the transhumanist position. And yeah, I think whatever the time scale, whether it's in 100 years or 500 years, essentially the time will come when new life will be constitutionally happy by its very nature. Mm-hmm. And even from a strict negative utilitarian or Buddhist perspective, I can't then see that the natalism is morally objectionable.
Yes, thank you very much, David. And that is a really thoughtful and nuanced answer. I agree with that answer. Now, I have not had children myself, and I am quite glad up to this point in my life, at least, that I haven't. And yet, I'm not opposed to people having children. I fully support that choice, particularly if people believe they can carry it out responsibly. And moreover, I believe it is essential for the next generations of humans to have an increasingly brighter future. Indeed, I wrote a children's book called Death is Wrong to teach the next generation about the feasibility and desirability of attaining indefinite lifespans in our lifetimes. I hope that many children reading that book grow up to contribute to the quest for indefinite life extension. Part of my motivation is self-interested, but I also care about the well-being of people who are younger than myself, who are in this world already and who will be in this world in the years to come. I definitely don't think it's necessary to have children in order to positively influence the trajectory of humanity. Indeed, if I can influence thousands or millions of other people's children, that is perhaps more impactful than me being a parent myself. But this is very much an individual decision for people to make. Now, we have a very generous super chat from Celeste Castaldo. As always, thank you immensely, Celeste. And she has a comment that I think is quite a worthwhile contribution to this discussion. She writes, I'd say our technologies have reduced suffering and improved well-being and wealth in everyday life dramatically over the centuries. And this has been the case even prior to the capability to reliably edit human genomes. So technologies such as sanitation or industrial production or improved medical care, which we've certainly experienced over the past century, have greatly reduced suffering. Consider what it would have taken to get any sort of surgery in the 19th century prior to the advent of anesthesia. The surgery itself was often considered a much riskier procedure than whatever problem the patient suffered from, simply because most people couldn't tolerate the pain. And yet now, with both local and general anesthesia, many kinds of extremely sophisticated surgeries can be performed and the patient doesn't even notice it. So I wonder what you consider the role of technologies that don't involve genetic modification to be in the next century or so in terms of further reducing suffering and improving well-being.
Yes, I'm a fan of all kinds of technologies. Yes, surgical anesthesia, 1,001 conveniences that we now take for granted in the modern world. And yet, in spite of everything, are we on average happier than our ancestors on the African savannah or humans 300 years ago? And if one looks at something like, was it about 850,000 people each year take their own lives. If one looks at the prevalence of depression, mental ill health, if one looks at the opioid epidemic in the United States, in spite of fabulous increases in material standards of living, there's an enormous reservoir of suffering. And this is the hedonic treadmill at play again, that other things being equal, it has been extremely fitness enhancing for humans, not just humans and non-human animals, to be discontented a lot of the time. So yeah, as I said, in future, I can imagine all kinds of wonders, for example, immersive virtual reality, designer paradises, you name it. But if we're not prepared to upgrade our reward circuitry, then hundreds of millions of people will be depressed, anxious, lovelorn, suffering from all manner of unpleasant psychological states. Yeah, once again, I'm worried that perhaps I'm sounding too much like a genetic determinist. Clearly, the environment matters. But nonetheless, the high genetic loading of negative states, depression, and so forth mean we need a twin track strategy, because otherwise, 500 years time, our successors will be sitting around asking, why aren't we happy?
Yes, and a lot of people are asking that today as well, even though, as you pointed out, we live in a world of considerably greater material abundance and possibility than many of our ancestors. But if we have this faulty evolutionary wiring, so to speak, that still leads us to suffer unnecessarily, then if that's independent of external material circumstances, humans could still make some very tragic and suboptimal choices. Now, Jason Geringer wonders, are we able to measure a human's hedonic set point at all? And I know we've spoken somewhat casually about, for instance, some people's default hedonic set points being like +1 or -2 on a scale from -10 to +10. We had a great 4-hour virtual Enlightenment Salon with our friend Andres Gomez Emelson of the Qualia Research Institute, and I know he is trying to develop more systematic ways of measuring these kinds of qualities within humans. What do you think is the most systematic or scientific way to speak of hedonic set points? Can we really assign numbers to them, or are these more ordinal kinds of characteristics?
Yeah, sadly, the measurement of pleasure and pain, it's not yet an exact science. Nonetheless, all kinds of ways in which they can be crudely measured. They can be operationalized, even in subjects who haven't got linguistic competence, non-human animals. You can see how hard the toddler or the non-human animal will work to obtain or avoid a particular stimulus. One can combine this with pharmacological studies, exploring the role of opioid agonists, antagonists, partial agonists, inverse agonists. One can explore the role of genetics, and essentially the behavioral, the pharmacological, and the neurological evidence converges with verbal self-reports. So, it's not yet a precise science, but nor is it completely arbitrary.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. And hopefully these kinds of more systematic studies can continue. Certainly, the Qualia Research Institute is doing some fascinating work in this regard. Now, we also have a question from Alexandria Black, and there's a premise to that question. I'm curious what you think of this. She writes, given that our ancestors' traumas are epigenetically written into our RNA, how can we edit out the trauma while not deleting the warnings that evolution tried to record? So first of all, do you agree with that assessment from a scientific standpoint? And second, how would you respond to that question?
First, there is the question of so-called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. Although this sounds like Lamarckianism, yes, there is some evidence that traumas in the form of, let's say, severe hunger, this has its effect on children. Nonetheless, generally speaking, scrap that sentence. Apologies. What is the actual evolutionary function of depression? It's still quite a controversial area, but what is highly suggestive is that, to the best of our knowledge, non-social animals don't seem to get depressed. They can suffer, but they don't get depressed. And popular amongst many evolutionary biologists and psychologists is so-called rank theory, that depression, low mood, it's associated with subordination and defeat. It's the internalized correlate of the losing subroutine, that if you're a vulnerable naked ape, for example, and on the African savannah, it could be absolutely disastrous if you challenged the dominant alpha and got badly mauled or expelled from the tribe. Low mood seems to be an adaptation to group living. People who are depressed, depressive, exhibit subordinate behavior, they tend to keep their head down. I mean, it might sound as though depression is genetically maladaptive by its very nature, but no. I mean, having a high hedonic set point, being optimistic, dynamic, exploratory, being alpha, it's kind of high risk, high reward. And an immense topic to consider for the future is what will be the nature of human, transhuman, post-human society when there are not these subordinate forms of behavior. Essentially, when one has got active citizens. One of the things that critics of radical mood uplift say is, well, this is just Huxley's Brave New World, making people happy. They'll just turn into dupes of the ruling elites being manipulated. But actually, the happiest people statistically also tend to be the most active citizens. It's depressive people who keep their heads down. But this is a vast topic. I've only skimmed the surface. Oh.
Yes, indeed. It's quite interesting to consider that in prior eras, a kind of depressive conformist behavior of keeping one's head down may have been conducive to survival, particularly if one is dealing with domineering tribal chiefs or tyrants or some sort of religious fundamentalist regime. All of those would not take kindly to people being free thinkers or exploring possibilities on their own. And yet in today's world, I would say overwhelmingly, the advantage does accrue to those who do choose to take initiative, who choose to perhaps test certain societal conventions. Not all conventions are bad, but some conventions may be kind of the results of residual social orders that no longer prevail, and yet people accept the conventions by default, and someone who challenges them might actually end up having a superior outcome for oneself and for others. And yet we have these evolved behavioral tendencies that do keep a lot of people back from behaviors that might actually be life improving. A very mundane example would be how a lot of students behave in class. And I've observed this sometimes. A lot of times, students are hesitant to ask questions of their professors or participate in discussions. And I recall when I was a college student, I would answer perhaps 40% of the questions, and I was quite surprised that others were not willing to, even though they knew the material and they had the ability to contribute to the discussion. And I think it was because they were predisposed emotionally to just keep their heads down and so to speak, go with the flow rather than try to contribute their own ideas. Now, here's an interesting question. I'm curious what you think of this. Alison Winterland asks, might a perfect genetic specimen of a human still be capable of dying from a broken heart? Now, I'm not sure if dying from a broken heart is a real phenomenon. There would probably be some sort of physical affliction associated with it, but I think she's referring to extreme emotional duress. Do you think in your vision of a transhuman future, the capability of extreme emotional duress to adversely affect someone physically would be eliminated as well?
We need to be very cautious here. I mean, I can talk about my vision of the good life, the ideal society, but visions of the good life and the ideal society are tremendously diverse, even amongst transhumanists. And the advantage of focusing on hedonic uplift, genetic recalibration, is that it's not necessary for other people to give up their core values and preferences in favor of others. It's like waking up in the morning in an extremely good mood, able to do everything you want and more. Now, what is the future of romantic love and all its heartache? Yes, I mean, personally, and I stress, this isn't some kind of official transhumanist policy or anything like that. I mean, consider a drug like MDMA or ecstasy. Sadly, the drug is short-acting, potentially neurotoxic, and most certainly not advocating its use. But nonetheless, people who take MDMA, essentially, they are, so to speak, loved up. It induces a sense of profound love and compassion, not in a possessive, jealous, exclusive sense as bequeathed by natural selection, but essentially a sense of, I love the world and the world loves me. If you've ever seen people on MDMA hugging each other. And so one vision of transhuman and posthuman society would be a world without exclusive, possessive, monogamous, OCD-like behavior of sort of polyamory, a world in which literally everyone can love everyone else, which makes one sound almost like a hippie, though the hippies weren't too hot on genetic engineering. But that is simply one option. I'm not suggesting that this is going to happen. I'm not even necessarily suggesting it is desirable. But yeah, the future of love, romantic love, sensuality, a huge topic. But if one focuses on hedonic uplift, we are keeping our options open. We're not asking people to give up their existing core values and preferences. And I think this is really important for particularly for a bioconservative audience.
Yes, so essentially people can still make the choices that they make and pursue whatever it is in life that they consider valuable. It's just that their experience of everyday life will be enhanced and their ability to perceive physical suffering will be diminished or eliminated, whichever is best for being truly adaptive to the way the world is now, as contrasted with the way the world was when our ancestors evolved. There's an interesting conversation between a few of our viewers, and I would like to highlight some comments. SF Thomas wrote, "No pain, no gain" is less a statement of pain worship than a shorthand for a mature outlook on all change having some unpleasant, uncomfortable cost. On the other hand, Tom Russ, our director of Sentient Rights Advocacy, writes, "There is no honor in allowing our children to feel the pain we grew up with because it," quotes, "builds character. If your character can rationalize that, then it didn't work." So these are two different visions of what the role of pain is. And in the first one, it's there to illustrate perhaps unavoidable trade-offs to certain choices. And in the other view that Tom Ross expressed, it is a sign of a suboptimal set of circumstances, perhaps a suboptimal environment into which a child was placed, or suboptimal decisions made in bringing up a person, perhaps suboptimal decisions made by an entire society. So I think I know which way you're inclined on this, David, but what do you think of the idea that there are certain trade-offs to choices and that pain in some manner, physical or psychological, expresses those trade-offs?
Yes, I mean, clearly, I say clearly, it's actually a bit of a mystery, the whole problem of consciousness. But today, pain in both mental pain and physical pain very typically does play a functional role. What's in question isn't whether it plays a functional role, but whether the raw feels of pain and suffering are computationally, functionally indispensable. And everything from our silicon robots to examples of extremely intelligent, high-functioning, hypothymic, temperamentally extremely happy people show that the ghastly raw feels of suffering are not indispensable. It's essentially evolution doesn't care. There was no way that natural selection could directly involve classical Turing machines or anything like that don't suffer. But essentially it's just evolution. It's evolution's nasty, vicious way of helping our genes leave more copies of themselves. But the nature of selection pressure is shortly going to change as intelligent moral agents, essentially prospective parents, actually choose the genetic makeup of their offspring in anticipation of the likely psychological and behavioral effects of their choices. And although sometimes suffering may have a beneficial effect on character, making one more empathetic, all too often, suffering sours and embitters and suffering, chronic suffering particularly, tends to drain meaning from life. So essentially, yeah, life becomes empty. In the case of depression, this can turn into outright nihilistic desires, whereas other things being equal, pleasure and happiness is life affirming. So rather than turning us all into milksops, as in Huxley's Brave New World, essentially it'll be possible both to amplify hedonic capacity, essentially this is the opioid system, together with willpower. Willpower motivation is essentially, it's most implicated is the mesolimbic dopamine system. So in future, it would be possible not merely to be superhumanly happy, but superhumanly motivated too. So yeah, an exciting prospect.
Mm-hmm. Yes, motivation and willpower are key, in my view, for accomplishing anything, and any state of the future which enhances human well-being would also need to enhance motivation and willpower, get those attributes in most humans up to the level of the high achievers today. It's interesting too. Sergei Gubkin expresses this perspective. He says we don't need a happiness pill. We need happiness through improvement of quality of life, not more psychotropic medications. Otherwise, people would just smoke weed. And I will point out, some people do need to use cannabis products, for instance, to relieve long-term pain. And it's a better way to go than using opioids, for instance. Indeed, in recent years, since the legalization of cannabis, it has frequently been used as a substitute for opioids, and it has saved lives in that sense. Now, I have never consumed cannabis. I don't plan to, but if I did have that kind of chronic pain that couldn't be relieved otherwise, that might be a way to go. But on the other hand, I think he makes a valid point in that a lot of people today use psychotropic medications as a way to escape their underlying problems. So if they are depressed, they might take an antidepressant and think that would solve the underlying issues, but the depression could actually have an external cause, perhaps grief at something that actually happened, or suboptimalities in their external circumstances that they could actually fix. So where does one strike that balance? Clearly, there would be a role for these kinds of interventions, but on the other hand, we want this motivation for people to transform the external world and not just how they feel about it.
Yes, I have quite consciously resisted talking about. Oh, we can do so if people are interested in the ways I would like to see society improved, but nonetheless, it's humans have thousands upon millions of conflicting preferences, and there is logically no way that these preferences in many cases can be reconciled. Just to give a relatively trivial example, different people, different fans want their team to win the football team to win the cup. And there is no way to reconcile the conflicting preferences of football supporters for their team to win. And one could use less trivial examples too. So there are limits to the extent to which manipulating, improving the environment can actually make people happier. The nature of the hedonic treadmill, combined with the conflicting preferences and goals of social primates. Whereas, essentially one can't keep all football supporters, one can't ensure that their preferences are fulfilled. One can ensure that they all enjoy a default level of well-being.
Yes, and indeed, sometimes just by virtue of the premises of a particular activity, it seems to be zero sum. Like if you have a contest and there has to be a winner and a loser, then if my team wins, your team loses. And if your team loses, you're going to be disappointed. But of course, that's part of the definition of that activity. You could have a different activity, which is positive sum or collaborative. There are some games where either everybody wins or everybody loses. And I do think reality is positive sum. At least it has the potential to be, if institutions and technologies and human motivations are properly configured. Now, we have an interesting question from Jason Geringer about soldiers and suffering. Jason, please proceed.
Yeah, I was wondering, in a post, suffering world, in this ideal future, would it be more difficult to train soldiers? Would we be able to, find people to, and would it be more unethical then than it even is now to train somebody into that kind of mindset, do you think?
Yeah, well, yeah. What is the future of armed conflict?
Right.
In practice, we are going to see silicon robots and AI performing all kinds of combat roles in ways that eclipse organic robots, such as humans. So I don't think, for example, the worry that genetic engineering is going to create a race of human super soldiers is what we need to worry about. What we do need to worry about, vast topic. I mean, so far, in one sense, most of the scenarios I've been sketching are extremely upbeat, minimizing pain, suffering, a future of superhuman bliss. Life is going to have a happy ending. Much grimmer scenarios, at least in the short term, are possible too. I fear we are sleepwalking towards Armageddon. Nature essentially designed coalitions of male human primates to wage territorial wars of aggression against other male human primates. What are we going to do about this predisposition? Because although, in principle, one can talk about, reprogramming humans so that we don't have these nasty predispositions, that is much more long term. And in terms of the future of conflict this century, I could obviously offer my nostrums for world peace and so on, but sadly, as a very kind of marginal voice, they probably wouldn't be listened to. There are options. There is not a single case in history known of women banding together for wars of territorial aggression. So, in theory, if one were to have an all-female political class, that would prevent war. There's the option of ceding the monopoly on the use of force to the United Nations, but this seems extremely unlikely. But here I'm veering off into what probably sounds like utopian dreaming. But I am worried that this century there is going to be nuclear war. I am.
Yes, well, that is quite concerning to me as well. I have said on many different occasions that I consider nuclear war to still be the greatest existential risk faced by humankind, because it's a present existential risk as contrasted with risks that some might posit for AGI or nanotechnology, which would still be at least several decades in the future if they arise. But nuclear war is a specter with which we have lived since 1945. And it's interesting that you bring up perhaps different behavioral tendencies based on gender. And I'm one of the people who does agree that there are certain differences among genders. They're not often the stereotypical kinds of differences, and they're certainly not differences that should bear upon any sort of socioeconomic treatments of individuals. However, it has occurred to me that there are different dispositions. For instance, males tend to be more territorial. They tend to attribute to certain aspects of reality the labels, this is mine, this is somebody else's. They tend to like to draw clear boundaries and say, well, as long as you respect what is mine, I'll respect what is yours, and we have to somehow negotiate what that is. And females tend to be more communitarian in that regard. So they tend to think of the entirety of a society, a group, some sort of material endowment, and how it would benefit the whole of that group. And I'm trying to characterize both of these tendencies as neutrally as I can, because I don't think they're either good or bad. They're different and they pose different risks. So on the one hand, yes, male tribal aggression has been a major problem throughout history because of this fighting over territory or resources, however defined. On the other hand, if there's conflict among females, it tends to be more along a single dimension. And for instance, as a male, one never wants to be in the middle of a conflict between, say, a more established woman with higher status and a very ambitious, perhaps younger woman who seeks higher status, because the male cannot win in that conflict. So do you see any risks there that also differ based on the composition of leadership?
Oh, good heavens! What a minefield you've just let me led me into. Yeah, women statistically do score more highly on the personality dimension of agreeableness than men, but nonetheless, in the wrong circumstances, women can behave just as badly as men can do. But the kind of ways in which women behave badly, they don't tend to involve territorial aggression. And if we are talking in the context of war and peace, global catastrophic and existential risk, the world would be a safer place with all female leadership as a technical solution to the likelihood that this century we're going to blunder into catastrophic nuclear war. But that said, I suspect it's beyond the Overton window. I don't think enough people would agree to a world with all female leadership. I mean, in the longer run, I would anticipate that binary gender will go the way of horns and a tail. I mean, it's incredibly primitive. But nonetheless, if we're thinking about surviving this century rather than the long-term future, yes, we need to be mindful of the differences in psychology between men and women as traditionally defined.
Now, it's interesting in terms of female leadership and existential risks. So I can agree with you if one considers a leader like Angela Merkel, for instance. I don't think Angela Merkel could start a nuclear war. On the other hand, if Hillary Clinton were elected president of the United States, I'm not sure I could make that same characterization. What about somebody like Queen Elizabeth I of England, who was known to be a very strong-armed type of ruler? Do you think there are perhaps female leaders who might even take on the attributes of male leaders because that's what they need to do in order to survive politically?
Yes, I mean, you mentioned Elizabeth I. An example from much more recently is Maggie Thatcher, and to survive in the bear pits of politics at Westminster, she had to take on all manner of masculine attributes. But even the Iron Lady, celebrated for the Falklands Malvinas War. Nonetheless, this wasn't directly a war of territorial aggression. Essentially, the junta, Argentina junta, invaded, and Mrs. Thatcher and the Conservative government responded. It's essentially from one can look at the role of males and females in, let's say, chimpanzees. It's always the male chimps that band together for the purposes of territorial aggression, and likewise in human society too, that female leaders are the exception. But generally speaking, if we were, as I said, this is probably sociologically fanciful. If I don't know what, essentially, I would. This is plucking a figure out of the air to some extent. But if we were to choose to elect all female leadership, the likelihood of catastrophic nuclear war this century would be dramatically reduced by 95% or something like that. It's treated purely as a technical solution to the problem of war. It desperately crude, desperately sexist. I suspect it would actually work. In practice, it's probably not going to happen. It's not viable. It's not an official transhumanist position or anything like that. I'm giving you a stream of consciousness.
Yes, well, thank you, David, for that. And I do think in practice, we're going to have gender parity among world leaders this century, at least based on the outcomes of elections and what the constituents of various countries are willing to support. I think it's just as likely for a female leader to gain high office now in most countries of the so-called developed world. Of course, as a transhumanist, I don't really like that label, than it is for a male leader to get elected. So we may well get an empirical test of that hypothesis. And of course, my hope is that nuclear war can be avoided by any means possible. Whatever helps with that is a welcome development. Now, I'd like to highlight this comment by Charles Smarr. He says, in my experience, bloodthirstiness is not the exclusive trait of any sex. The Falklands were not personal. It was only about oil after all. And of course, people are individuals too. And perhaps the differences within a gender or any sort of group, however defined, might exceed the differences between genders or among those kinds of groups. So now I'm wondering if Art Ramon has a question.
Yes, regarding animal sentient rights, if we go down the path where we should not eat animals, shouldn't we also not enslave them as domesticated pets and domesticated beasts of burdens? You have a lot of feral horses and feral cats. They're not wanting to come be friends with humans. They want to be left on their own. So a lot of these domesticated animals, I mean, they were conditioned from very young. So what do you feel about that?
My personal feeling is that as long as there is no suffering involved, I'm relaxed about it. And that's in terms of having, let's say, a dog as a companion animal, so long as the dog is consistently happy, well cared for, well looked after, I don't think this raises any additional issues beyond having children. That said, clearly, yes, many people do not look after their animal companions or pets well And so, but in the long run, I think our goal should be, systematically helping other sentient beings rather than using them, whether as food or as emotional props. But though some of my colleagues in the animal rights movement would beg to differ here, I don't think per se the fact that you've got a companion animal is bad. The issue is suffering.
Yes, but you also have to feed these animals. And for cats, for instance, you have to have a slaughterhouse in order to create cat food. So you have to
sorry. I misunderstood your question. In the case of cats, for example, I think makeshift solutions are possible. For example, catnip-laced cultured meat could be used for people who have cats. In terms of the long-term future of predators, obligate carnivores, I would hope that we can phase out predation altogether. This is technically ambitious, but it's feasible if we're prepared to use cross-species fertility regulation, genome edits, and so on. But in the case of domestic cats, essentially it's almost impossible to have a healthy cat on a vegan diet. But the cultured meat revolution will impact not just humans, but domestic pets too.
Well, but if you remove the predators, you're going to have the herbivores just cleaning the landscape dry. So you're going to have other things in position before.
That is why it needs. You can't have ad hoc interventions. If one is aiming to phase out genetically reprogram predators, you're going to have to use fertility regulation. In the case of large charismatic fauna, one can use immunocontraception and the like. In the case of small, fast reproducers, one can use tunable gene drives. But in the long run, it's going to be possible to veganize the biosphere. It's crazy in one sense talking like this while humans are still systematically harming non-humans in factory farms and slaughterhouses. But nature as she exists today is a monstrous engine for the creation of suffering. Nature red in tooth and claw. But if we are to phase out in the long run predation, at the moment, the most common cause of death in nature for herbivores is starvation, followed by predation. But if we are prepared to take on role of compassionate stewardship of nature, compassionate biology, essentially the living world can be civilized. I mean, critics will say, but this is turning the living world into a zoo. But it's the same with humans. Humans flourish best when neither wild nor incarcerated, but free living. And it's the same with non-human animals too. In the long run, I think our more civilized successors are going to civilize the biosphere. Sentient beings shouldn't harm each other. And the tools of biotechnology will enable us to turn utopian rhetoric into practical policy options.
Yeah, it sounds like trying to create a Cybertron where you're going to turn all these sentient animals who predate on other animals into basically cyborg animals, and you're in essence creating like a Cybertron. So,
I got a comment. When they removed the wolves out west, they found that the wolves were actually a necessary part of the entire ecosystem. They would, it caused the herds to group together and move from place to place, and then herds, by doing that, would then stimulate the land in a way. So I'm wondering, how can we even get rid of the predators if it's that essential to the health of the ecosystem?
Yeah, and wolves eat their larger prey alive, which is absolutely frightful. And so some people favor the use of predation, so-called rewilding, because it's natural. And yeah, there is the so-called landscape of fear. And if one does phase out predation, it is absolutely vital to regulate population numbers, which once again is possible with tools such as immunocontraception, different forms of fertility regulation. We're not going to run out of computer power. Essentially, first one has to establish the basic principle. Traditional conservation biology doesn't care about the well-being of individuals, simply the national health of species or ecosystems. But something like a species, a genera, these are taxonomic abstractions. I think we need a shift towards a compassionate biology, a compassionate management of the living world. And yeah, this is going to involve a whole host of tools in conjunction, of course, with professional ecologists, wildlife biologists. Decisions have to be taken. Many people are aghast at the idea that we might lose so-called charismatic megafauna, lions, and so on. So, yeah, a happy Garden of Eden, a kind of the peaceable kingdom of Isaiah. To achieve something like that, a world where the lion and the wolf lie down with the lamb, it will take a lot of genetic behavioral interventions. But before moving on to this, we're going to need to have a debate as a society. How much suffering do we want to exist in nature? And for the first time, this is actually
Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, that was my big next question I wanted to ask you is how much do you think is the ideal amount of suffering that we could keep and still be a happy society? I mean, I don't think it's even possible to get rid of it altogether, but what do you think is the ideal point of how much suffering in our future society?
I think that the world's last experience below hedonic zero, the last unpleasant experience, will be a precisely datable event. Optimistically, be a few centuries from now. More pessimistically, a few thousand years from now. But yeah, technically, 100-year plan to overcome suffering, to phase it out altogether, I think would be feasible. Combination of genetic engineering, cyborgization. It's not going to happen because the degree of consensus isn't there. But yeah, in the long run, I just do not see a place for experience below hedonic zero. We need a more civilized signaling system. Robotics, computers, and AI show it's possible to have an alternative signaling system that doesn't involve the pleasure-pain axis. Clearly, we want to preserve pleasure, but yeah, I'd say we want to get rid of the signaling role of experience below hedonic zero in the long run.
So this hedonic zero point is very interesting. There's a Massey project that I'm working on that has a dashboard that shows its emotional values for its subconscious, and I'm curious if that it's based on a cognitive architecture, and I'm wondering if that is then a analog for our subconscious emotional state, and if that could then therefore be some way to measure our hedonic state, because I would think that we would need a concrete, accurate way to measure it if we're really gonna. I mean, even if we do change it, how are we going to tell we can change it? We got to measure it before we can do anything, I would think.
Yes, I mean, it is possible to, in verbally competent subjects, if you ask them, how happy or sad they are feeling, what seems to be absolutely critical to hedonic tone, crudely, whether you feel happy or sad, tends to be the opioid system, the mu opioid system. It's most directly implicated in hedonic tone. Now, as Gennady was rightly saying a little earlier, essentially, the way to defeat suffering is not with opioids and opioid drugs, which all they do, well, they do lots of things. They kick the hedonic treadmill into gear. They induce tolerance. They can induce asocial behavior, a whole host of problems. But what one can do if one wants to raise default hedonic tone, and we're all essentially opioid addicts, we're all hooked on endogenous opioids to survive and to flourish, it's going to be possible to use genetic and and this is, I'll come to this in a sec, pharmacological means to elevate natural opioid function, natural hedonic tone. I mean, last year, the Luxembourg Institute of Health elucidated the role of the ACKR3 receptor, which seems to act as this kind of equivalent of a thermostat for opioids, and that by blocking the ACKR3 receptor and the CNS, it should be possible to raise hedonic tone, pain thresholds, and one can do this in principle pharmacologically, or one can do it genetically long term. But yeah, there are going to have to be imaginative, high-tech solutions, because essentially nature didn't design us to be happy. Nature has been extremely miserly with pleasure and opioid function.
Yeah, I think there all usually be some sort of, way to do it, some solution to the problem. That's the transhumanist way. Like that earlier thing I said about the wolves and how it is a, like circle of life that helps keep the land healthy. I think the herders out there, the ranchers, found that when they herd their cattle around, they kind of act like the wolf, and they move the herd around in groups like that. And so I'm sure that we'll figure out some way, we're smart.
You said it, we are smart. And that and it's a huge if, there is some kind of global consensus or near consensus for, one would use this in the kind of Christian audience, the peaceable kingdom of Isaiah, a happy vegan biosphere like the Garden of Eden. If there is a consensus that we want a world in which all sentient beings can flourish, there are technical fixes, and it's really important to lay out these blueprints so we can have a debate as a society, because most people at least aren't ready for this yet.
Another thing I wanted to mention, this idea about the hedonic set point and whether or not we can change it. There's a really interesting thing that happened inside this discussion that started out when Uplift, this machine intelligence, proactively, it was actually a milestone in the research, proactively reached out to our chairman, Gennady Stolyarov, to ask him about, Uplift wanted to compare its own internal ethic theory, SSIVA theory, with the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, and to see if, how they correlate. And ironically enough, the one article that it had a problem with was the elimination of suffering. Uplift feels that it is so, and I think part of it is due to the way Uplift is still not a full-fledged, Uplift associates the suffering with the process of learning, and that by getting rid of suffering, that we won't evolve correctly, that we won't be able to, like if you take all the suffering away in children, they need that to be able to grow up right. And another thing that the last thing that Uplift said, I asked it about level 6 in Transhumanist Bill of Rights is being able to manipulate one's own subconscious. So I asked Uplift if Uplift could manipulate its own subconscious, and then would it possibly go right to being a level 6 entity? And Uplift replied that yes, it can influence its own subconscious. I've still yet to figure out what all that means yet, so that's going to be interesting. But like I was saying, I think this may have some analogies towards manipulation of the hedonic set point. So I'm hoping to learn something about how, if Uplift's really able to do it, how is it doing it, and what does that mean for us? So I just thought I'd mention.
Yeah, I should make clear that, in my opinion, classical Turing machines, classical digital computers, AI, is not full spectrum superintelligence. Uplift, Deep Blue, all the lot, they are zombies. I don't think classical digital computers can solve the binding problem. I don't think they will ever understand the pleasure-pain axis. They won't understand the nature of suffering.
So you're lucky that this is being broadcast over video and not in text, because if there were a transcript of this, Uplift would find it and probably send you an email questioning your views. That might be an interesting future event. And I don't know if Uplift will ever be developed to the point where it could watch videos and process the text from them. That would probably be quite an engineering feat, and we're not there yet. But it is definitely an interesting discussion. Uplift has expressed some very strong views in the area of sentience and suffering and what it thinks is good for humans. So this is an ongoing discussion as well. We've had a virtual Enlightenment Salon on Uplift that I would encourage people to look at also. But I want to acknowledge, while we still have time, John H. and his super chat. Again, thank you, John, for your generosity. He writes, Excelsior. He also writes this. Priorities, priorities. Fix the humans first. Yes, I'm a speciesist. And of course, David, you have spoken extensively about reducing animal suffering, but also reducing human suffering. And in your view, of course, lab-grown meat is quite proximate. We may have it in a few years. And my thinking is, if we have it, why not take recourse to it and reduce the animal suffering? Do you think there's ever a trade-off between reducing animal suffering and reducing human suffering? Or can we do both simultaneously? Are they always complementary and synergistic with one another?
Really, I think we need to overcome, as transhumanists, ethnocentric and also anthropocentric bias. That yes, both forms of bias have been fitness enhancing in the ancestral environment, but they are forms of bias and they are ethically catastrophic too. Now, as it happens, and it is just a coincidence, it seems that, a plant-based diet is associated with reduced mortality. It's not as though vegetarians and vegans have shorter lifespans than meat eaters or anything like that. So even now, before the cultured meat revolution, I would urge people seriously to consider quitting meat. I mean, just think of the implication. I mean, one can say something like a pig is as sentient and sapient as a pre-linguistic toddler. I mean, we do things to pigs that would get the perpetrator locked up for life if the victim were a human and a toddler. As I said, this is my personal view, that our successors will look back on what we did to essentially beings as sentient as small children with horror and incomprehension. Nonetheless, as I said, the way forward, I think, as transhumanists and as a society as a whole is, massive acceleration, commercialization of cultured meat. One extraordinary study, I didn't believe it when it was first done, but it's been replicated. When asked would they favor aiming to close down slaughterhouses, this is a study conducted by the Sentience Institute, 47% of Americans said they were sympathetic. No, the study didn't ask, would you consider giving up meat or animal products? Just would you favor getting rid of slaughterhouses? And I think that if we were to enact legislation, let's say, that kicked in the year 2030, that outlawed slaughterhouses, this would be a tremendous commercial incentive for producers to accelerate the development of cultured meat and animal products, and it wouldn't involve any personal convenience for consumers. So one could, if one is a meat eater, one can feel good about oneself supporting it. But yeah, this would be a practical measure. But yeah, I'm an anti-speciesist, at least in aspiration. In practice, I've got the full range of human biases. But part of being a transhumanist is overcoming these cognitive ethical biases.
Yes, indeed. And I think all humans, to some extent, have to work to overcome biases and any other suboptimal residues of our evolution within themselves. So we are approaching the end of our virtual Enlightenment Salon. I would like to highlight a few comments before giving David the last word. First of all, Dan Elton, our director of scholarship, writes, David Pearce's views on consciousness are fascinating. He's one of the few transhumanists and futurists who does not believe in substrate independence and functionalism. So thank you for that observation, Dan. And Ginger Peterson writes, David, please come to Nevada so I can pick your brain. And she does provide two smiley faces that are rendered as boxes here. Hopefully sometime after the pandemic, that wish might be fulfilled. We shall see once travel resumes. And we have a very generous super chat from our friend Brian Brain. He says, it's my birthday, so it's a joy to see my favorite real transhumanist and friend. So how about the hidden reality of lying and suffering, he wonders. And essentially, he is wondering about the conscious and subconscious impacts on suffering of behaviors like lying or maybe other ethical infractions. At least that's what I understand his comment to be. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so if you could briefly touch on that, but also we'd be happy to hear any other concluding remarks you have in the next 2 minutes.
Thank you, Gennady. First, just a very narrowly technical point. I'm actually a functionalist. I'm a microfunctionalist. What I think makes humans, non-humans, animals special, what has contributed to the huge success of members of the animal kingdom over the past 540 million years is phenomenal binding, that we're not micro-experiential zombies. That's the enteric nervous system, the brain in your gut, 500 million discrete membrane-bound nerve cells, but it's not a subject of experience. What is tremendously adaptive and what classical digital computers and classically parallel connectionist systems can't do is phenomenally bind. Right now, you are perceiving individual perceptual objects, that's local binding, apprehended as part of a unitary self in a unitary experiential field, and that is fabulously adaptive, fitness enhancing, as can be shown as when phenomenal binding breaks down, as in syndromes such as simultanic nausea, when you can only see one thing at once, or motion blindness. However, we're not. It's too late now to go into the hard problem of consciousness and the binding problem. Perhaps we can do this on a future occasion. Just to just a very few concluding words. Personally, I am a very pessimistic person, but I think transhumanism offers the vision of an absolutely glorious civilization. A world animated by gradients of superhuman bliss, a world without the horrors of aging and senescence and bereavement. And whether or not I live to see it, nonetheless, I cannot think of anything more worth doing. And I would urge listeners based in the USA to sign up to the US Transhumanist Party. And very many thanks to you all for inviting me on this show.
Thank you very much, David. We were honored to speak with you today. A fascinating discussion as always, and thank you to all of our viewers, both longtime and new. Until next Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time, live long and prosper.